Well, it's time. Let's get started. Well, first of all, thanks a lot, everyone. Really, I appreciate that you turn up this early on a topic about ETSI NFV and how it relates to OpenStack. My name is Frank Starsky. I'm a software engineer at Red Hat. And prior to Red Hat, I've actually been working for many, many years, or most of my career, in the telco industry. And so I've been through this NFV journey from day one.
Hi, my name is Gergely Csatari. I'm working for Nokia, and I'm actually, at this moment, responsible for this analysis on ETSI NFV side. So this is why I'm here.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about how ETSI NFV's specification requirements relate to OpenStack's reality. And while Gergely will present the analysis that's been done and some of the outcomes, I would like to give you some of the context that hopefully helps you qualify the results. Now, because you made it to the early session on NFV, I'm sure all of you, or majority of you, know what NFV or Network Function Virtualization is about. But just, in fairness to all those who don't, let me just briefly level set. So NFV, or Network Function Virtualization, is a business transformation of the telco industry, and really leapfrogging it from the mainframe era to the cloud era, or more precisely, to the era of network appliances that are vertically integrated, hardware-based stacks, physical stacks, with a lot of dedicated hardware and vendors taking end-to-end ownership, directly to the era in which you have cloud-native network functions or services running anywhere on a private or public cloud, right? But NFV is not only a technical transformation. That's around 10% of the story. 90% is really about the people, the processes, and the procurement, as Arash Arushia, the CTO from Deutsche Telekom, recently said at a larger event. So to trigger this NFV transformation, operators or the whole industry had to overcome a huge inertia, right? The operators had to experience such a strong pain and competitive pressure to say, yes, we will go through the pain of this additional transformation. And they were able to overcome the inertia of vendors, of network equipment vendors, basically telling them, look, no longer we're going to buy from you vertically integrated stacks. We want to buy the hardware, the platform, the software, the management systems separately from different vendors, no longer from a handful of incumbent suppliers. Also, they want to be able to swap out the hardware or any other piece of the architecture. That means suddenly you need to be multi-vendor, right? Your software needs to run on any other system. Plus, you get to rewrite billions of lines of code because, at the end of the day, you want to be cloud-native and microservice-based. And the trigger that made all this happen, overcoming the inertia happen, is called ETSI NFV. ETSI NFV is an industry group founded by the major operators worldwide, and that to this day is an NFV community with the broadest representation of stakeholders, namely not only the operators and vendors, but also regulators, consultants, system integrators. Everyone who's playing in that space has a representation in ETSI NFV. Now, why is it called ETSI NFV? Because the project is hosted by an organization called ETSI, the European Telco Standards Institute. And they chose this specific host. Why? Because, again, all of these stakeholders were already members of ETSI. ETSI provides a huge infrastructure for organizing large events, for doing testing, just the whole infrastructure. It's a little bit similar like the Linux Foundation, if you want. And they got to define their own governance rules, etc. Now, ETSI NFV takes an end-to-end view, right, across the whole stack. And I've shown to the right this ETSI NFV architecture, right? It's not an architecture, it's something that they created to explain NFV to other people and to position, and allowing everyone to position themselves within those diagrams. So let's say OpenStack consumes this small box in the whole diagram. There's a lot of stuff around it, and ETSI NFV is the only body that really has visibility of all the pieces coming together. Now, initially, its goal was just to create this in-stream momentum to overcome the inertia that I talked about earlier. It was meant to coordinate standards organizations around this picture. It was not planning to become one, yet this is what's happened eventually. Now, let me briefly talk about the typical standards methodology in the telco space. So standards, and especially telco standards, typically follow this, what's called a three-stage waterfall model. And of course, in the IT industry, we know waterfall models. In this specific model, you have what's called stage one, a definition of use cases and business and technical requirements. And once you've completed this phase, you go to a stage two, where you define the overall architecture, what are the boxes, who communicates with whom, how, and what are the information models, what kind of information do you need to represent an exchange. And then, of course, you go to a third stage that's called stage three, and it's about the actual implementation, so defining the protocols, the APIs, and the data models. So the actual data you put onto the wire and that you exchange between elements. Now, this model is iterative, right? So there are multiple releases. Once you've finished one cycle, you go into the next cycle and add more features. The difference to an open source project is that such a cycle would be a multi-year thing, right? And why is that the case? Well, imagine we would submit changes, get those changes reviewed, and eventually merged manually using Word documents, right, to process the patches and merge them into the master document. And that you would need a +2 per company and from every company that's present. So now you can get an idea of why this process is so slow. Standards in general are meant to be implementation agnostic, right? They define the interaction between components, but they should, in a well-made standard, should not influence how the standard is implemented in detail. They also take a standards-first approach. They have the possibility to say, well, if something's in the standard, vendors who want to claim compliance to the standard are forced to implement as is with all the advantages and potential flaws that exist in the standards. And you validate through reference implementations, right? Reference implementations are just there to show this standard works and is interoperable. It does not mean that it's fit for production, that it's HA, scalable, performant, whatever. And of course, you have vendor feedback, and that provides a feedback loop where, in rare cases, you go up again in this waterfall model. And finally, IPR is a hugely important thing in the telco standard space. You want to push your intellectual property into standards, thereby forcing vendors to implement against that. And they implement FRANs, so fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms, in order to protect themselves, right? Because you put an upper bound on the licensing fees. And so this is why the telco industry is extremely sensitive about this issue of IPR, because it can cost them billions. Okay, so now circling back on what does this conflict between standards on the one hand and open source on the other hand mean for what happened with ETSI NFV versus and the open source communities? Well, first of all, as I said before, standards organizations want to create a standard for a specific API. In this case, an API for an infrastructure as a service platform, right? And they were thinking, like, if we create one API, then everyone else would come if all the vendors would be coming and implement against this API that they've designed. Now, it eventually turned out that you cannot really force public cloud providers like Amazon, Google, and whatever, who pioneered these APIs to conform to something that's been created by a standards organization. There's also very little incentive for VMware to change their proven APIs. And of course, most importantly for us, is there any reason for OpenStack to change their proven APIs against this model? And so it turned out that most vendors in the ETSI NFV space were planning to create a product based on OpenStack, and so they themselves did not really have an incentive to completely swap out and replace an API for something that ETSI NFV created, or what was going to create, because it would just add cost, but no benefits, actually. Right? So that was the situation at one point in ETSI NFV. And so people were trying to figure out how do we actually close functional gaps that did exist in OpenStack, and how do we foster interoperability between different vendor implementations, be it open source or not. And eventually, what they did is say, okay, we need some kind of hybrid model, right? They took some telco people, created a new open source community called OpenNFV that was really there to say, we integrate different upstream components, we test that they all work together under the requirements that we need, we fill any gaps by working in the upstream, then sourcing it again from there, and then provide actually the missing implementation feedback to ETSI NFV, right? And then ETSI NFV, like initially they tried to create a race with the open source community and then pretty quickly figured out that doesn't work. And so at least on this virtual infrastructure management level, they took a step back and said, let's focus on the what needs to be done and why, and not anymore on the how. Now, to facilitate the interaction between standards and open source communities, ETSI NFV created one new work item, a dedicated team of people that was initially led by me and is now led by Gergely. And what we did is we tried to create awareness of the different cultures, the different methodologies of these two communities, and also to connect between the two. So we got representatives from different open source communities into ETSI NFV, into the big forum, and we had a discussion about how can this collaboration work? What do you expect from us? What do the others expect? And it turned out, of course, that the standards people didn't understand you cannot just throw a requirement across the wall and then expect somebody to pick it up and implement it. You need to more proactively work with them. And again, one of the outcomes was, let's work with them via OpenNFV as a kind of neutral ground. We also took several measures to facilitate feedback into ETSI NFV. The original standards specification process was completely closed. You had to be a member. At least we've changed it to a certain extent that they said every interim draft is going to be publicly available, and we're going to create mechanisms to provide feedback. And so, for example, one of those mechanisms is that we said, let's reach out during the PTGs and the summits, let's organize forum sessions, let's collect this feedback, synthesize it, and basically bring it back to the ETSI NFV community, and that's what we did, right? We had a session at the Denver PTG, collected the feedback, brought it back, and they're currently discussing how to address these issues. And finally, there's some work, this is basically the focus of today, so it's a very long introduction, sorry for that. It's really about analyzing OpenStack's gaps versus those ETSI NFV specifications. And that's actually pretty difficult. Why? Because, as I said, they stopped at the stage 2, saying what's the architecture, what's the kind of information operations we need, and we need to compare this against OpenStack as an actual stage 3 implementation, right? So that comparison is already difficult, but it's hugely important. Why? Because of procurement, right? Because many operators are asking vendors, is your implementation ETSI NFV compliant according to spec so-and-so? And what is the vendor supposed to answer? We don't know, right? That's the truth. We don't know. So we're answering, yes, it's partially compliant, and here's what we mean with it, right? Because we fulfill all the functional requirements of the spec. So let me hand over at this point to Gary, who's going to walk us through the, well, details of the analysis that has been done.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Right, yes, so I will tell you briefly what we did in this analysis. So that was like, I don't know, maybe a 2-year-long process or something like that. So, and the approach for this analysis was that we are doing like a functional comparison of ETSI NFV specs and the OpenStack APIs, because the ETSI NFV specs are also describing an API. So there are different data models described there, and so on and so on. And of course, OpenStack APIs are also like a ready implementation. But we took the liberty to interpret the functionality described in the ETSI NFV specs on a functional level. So if there was something described in the ETSI NFV specs what could be the same functionality could be achieved with several API calls from OpenStack side, then we said that, okay, that's working and that's okay, and we are happy with that one. We worked in a way that we created a gigantic Google spreadsheet where we listed all the different APIs and API parameters, and we did this comparison inside the Google spreadsheet. So this was more like a working document. So it's not, let's say, for public eyes. It's very messy, lots of data, lots of comments, lots of details there. And then from that Google spreadsheet, we like filtered out basically 3 different things. These potential gaps, which are functionalities what we think are missing from OpenStack. We collected things what we called user stories, which are basically questions to the ETSI NFV community in the form of like artificial user stories. So we were trying to figure out why they put the given functionality into the ETSI NFV specifications, and we bring these user stories to ETSI NFV and discuss them. And then we found actual bugs in the specifications, what we called inconsistencies, just to be nice. And we collected these in a wiki, and of course we had to review them in several iterations with different working groups. Finally, we reached a situation when we started to contribute to ETSI NFV specifications. So based on these findings, we actually like executed that feedback loop, which was on the previous slide. So from this analysis, we changed the stage 2 specifications in ETSI, which was not really easy because you know that also means lots of processing, lots of Word document generation, lots of meetings and discussion and so on and so on. But at the end, we managed to like close these things what we call user stories. So basically, we removed functionality from these specifications which were not justified by ETSI NFV, and we fixed the errors what we found in the specifications. Then also we published these gaps in a public NFV wiki, so it can be accessed by anybody. And then, so these gaps are formulated in a very ETSI-specific language. So they are talking about documents, they are talking about chapters in documents, and they are following the ETSI NFV data model, which is not the same as what's used in OpenStack. So I, let's say, translated these gaps to OpenStack terminology, and I created an Etherpad, what we used in the Denver workshop, and which is still available, and you can reach it. So you can reach those under these links. And we uploaded the presentation to a portal, and I think it will be available for download at some point of time, so you don't need to like remember the links. Okay, so that was how we worked, and this is the phase what we reached. So we have a like list of gaps, translated the OpenStack language, let's say. We made some fixes, and we are still making fixes to the ETSI specifications. And now we are in a phase when we are trying to facilitate some kind of a communication between these two communities. So as Frank said, that in the Denver workshop, we got some feedback from OpenStack. So we took that feedback, discussed it in ETSI NFV, and now I have the result of that feedback in the Etherpad. So there, for example, one feedback was that there is no use case for the gaps, so there is no high-level reasoning for the gaps. So I just asked for this reasoning, I added them to the Etherpad. So there is now some kind of a communication between these two communities. It's not very fast, but it's at least something. Okay, so as I mentioned, we actually compare these two things, so the APIs and the specifications, but we had to have some kind of a baseline if you would like to do some comparisons. So we took the latest ETSI drafts, which were version 2.1.1 at that point of time, and then we took Okata release with TC approved release text. So somehow we had to limit ourselves what to analyze. This Okata actually is the end where we finished the analysis. I don't know, we iterated around several OpenStack cycles, so we reanalyzed that at every half a year.
Somehow this open source worked just faster than
yes.
standards.
But this is where we decided
to rebase a couple of times, right?
Yeah. But this is where we decided, okay, we stop here now, and we say that, okay, now we have these gaps, and we have to work on these, and we have to somehow make an agreement on these gaps. So, but I would like to highlight that this is not just we analyzed these standards and we found these gaps, and now we are throwing this to the OpenStack community, but this was really a feedback process where we actually did changes to IFA documents, and we are, let's say, now collecting or trying to collect from the OpenStack community in different forms like this. So the analysis outcomes in terms of numbers. So we found 14 bugs, and I created these contributions. So these contributions are actually Word documents, but you can imagine them as changes. So these are really containing the changes in syntax highlight, and people are throwing comments, and you have to really get +2 from everybody to get it merged, and it's really merged half a year after you discuss them. And then we identified 33 of these user stories. So these user stories here now, what I'm talking about are let's say functionalities which are in the IFA specifications, but not in OpenStack, and not really justified to be in the IFA specifications. So I created 47 contributions. So I removed these things from IFA. Actually, I also put there some stuff which was missing, but okay. So I just fixed some things, and then we have these 22 gaps, which are actually missing things from OpenStack. These are described on, let's say, different level, and they are in covering lots of areas. And now you can ask, like OpenStack people, okay, why are you coming with these gaps? So what are these gaps, and how do you justify them? So it's important to understand that telco workloads are different from IT workloads, because telco industry works in a way that we like everything to be shared. So we don't use that many spare capacity. We calculate the needed capacity more, and we have so we like predictable things. And also we have to deal with physics. So we are handling real-time traffic, which means that we need low latency handling of both networking and compute in certain places of the network. But at the same time, these networks have to be always working. So this is the thing where your 911 call goes through. So it's different from, I don't know, posting a messenger message or something. So it's really like human lives depend on these things. So this is why telco industries like to go to for sure things. And also because these networks are very big and very difficult, lots of different iterations of the networks are piled into one and each other. So we have 2G, 3G, 4G, and all of these are supported. We have very big and very complex management systems, which should be backward compatible. So you cannot just swap out all the management system at once. So this is why the network have to provide mechanisms for these big and complex systems to gather all the data from every piece of the network, including the infrastructure, and provide an overview for the operator. So this is why just some examples what we found missing things. This is why we identify resource reservation as one thing what is missing. The support for different hardware acceleration, direct access to hardware features, or this CPU pinning kind of things. Also, because of the management systems that are managing really lots of objects, we identified the need for a publish-subscribe model instead of continuous polling, because if you are polling I don't know, 3 million objects continuously, that just saturates everything only for the management. And we have lots of these gaps, and we have a session tomorrow, actually, also at a very early time. But if you're interested in the detailed discussion of these gaps, we will have it as a forum session tomorrow from 9:50. Okay, so we reached this point. What will happen now? So currently we are processing the outcome of the Denver workshop. So I don't know if you are aware of. I hope you are. We had this ETSI NFV meets OpenStack, or OpenStack meets ETSI NFV workshop in Denver, because just out of pure luck, we had the two teams at the same time, at the same time. So we got, thanks to Ildiko, we got a room from the foundation, and we could put everybody into the same room, and we had a discussion. And in this discussion, we covered these gaps, and we have feedback from you, from OpenStack, to work a bit better description of the gaps. I'm currently doing this, and we got the feedback that there is a need for a user story for the gaps, so some kind of a higher level use case why this gap is there, and we actually have it now. So I just had a meeting with ETSI NFV, and they so-called noted these documents, so that means that they have said, okay, you can use them. And then a priority order of the gaps was requested, and this is hard. So this is really tough, because even inside ETSI NFV, there is no agreement on the priority of these gaps, and it would take years to create this priority order. So currently I'm, let's say, I have very high level priority of these, and I have an agreement from IFA of these, but this is just like high, mid, low. But I think we will never have a really a backlog kind of priority list for this, and I believe that we have to live with that. And as you can see, currently we are working on this consensus on the gaps. So let's have a common agreement of these gaps between ETSI NFV and OpenStack, and this is why I'm working on this forum session, and this is why we have this current session. So we are willing to take feedback from you and discuss that with ETSI NFV, and then coming back another session and show the result of that. And also at certain point of time, we will need to create the so-called detailed specification of the gaps, so which are like real specifications to actual OpenStack projects, which are describing what should be exactly changed in these projects. And of course, we will need to implement these gaps. And of course, if you are interested in any of these, then reach out for us and help us. And now it's your turn. So if you have any questions or comments, please. Can we have a mic? Oh, first here. Ladies first.
So you already mentioned that the cycles of refresh between the standards organization and the open source are quite different. So how do you intend to keep up and sync up between what ETSI is doing and what is happening in OpenStack?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's if ETSI NFV is still planned to do the actual specification that, and expecting others to implement, that yes, they would have a very slow turnaround, and actually that would be good for us, right? Because we have a good chance to catch up, right? The good thing about standards is it really tries to distill the essence of the whole standards community of all the stakeholders. Like many of the very, very important requirements actually came from the security community, who said, in the telco industry, because it's so heavily regulated, here's the list of things you need to be aware of in order to be security compliant. And it was a huge list. And then, of course, vendors step by step implemented that, and we are mostly there, I would say, right? At least on the basic certification requirements. And then, of course, there's lawful intercept and all these things that are still to come, right? But yeah, the good thing is that about standards is that they are reasonably stable, right? So yeah, for us it's good to...
But that's the thing, the standards are reasonably stable, and OpenStack or open source in general can take a left turn suddenly, and just go off in a completely different direction. And
yeah,
how do you
like
make sure that doesn't happen?
right? Yes.
But I mean, containerization is taken care of by ETSI, because when they started looking at it, they were trying to be very roundabout, not saying VM, but like a wrapper, a container.
So it's really that the role, or let's say the balance between standards and implementer communities. I'm just generalizing it from open source. It's generally implementers that has changed, right? The industry is moving a lot faster, as you said, than the standards can keep up. So we need to find a new balance. And the balance is really to provide the bigger picture context that ETSI NFV and only ETSI NFV can actually provide, right? Because all players get together, they have the whole stack view. And oftentimes in the OpenStack community, we're lacking the understanding of how is actually our product being used in practice. And Gerli mentioned it earlier, right? I mean, if you consider that there are management systems on a very high layer, legacy systems, that try to create an image of what's happening in the network in terms of resources and services. And the source of truth is actually on the OpenStack level, right? Because we know what are the physical resources, what virtual machines have we provisioned on them, etc. There needs to be a process of reconciliation between these two inventories, right? And we're not making it easy yet for these two systems to keep in sync, right? Through pub/sub mechanisms that Gerli described, or even batch operations. And there are other areas where it really, really helps to understand the context, to have a distillation of the user needs.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So if we close the gaps and if we make some modifications to the OpenStack APIs, do you see any negative impacts to current OpenStack users, non-telco users?
No, I think these gaps can be closed in a backward compatible way without affecting the current functionality of OpenStack.
Yes, of course, there's always this possibility to create some telco-specific fork of OpenStack, but I think the whole industry agrees that we must not allow this to happen, right? We must realize that all these features that telcos are actually asking for are very, very similar also from other verticals, like the finance industry. They have pretty much similar requirements. It was just telco was leading on them. Right? And so we always have to ensure that whatever we produce is useful across all the verticals, if you want.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mine is more of a comment than a question, but so I've come from a telco side of things, and I think standards are great, but at the same time, they are history. I mean, products and services from telco point of view are going to evolve, and they're going to be different means of services and application. Very similar happen in IT. So you talked about E91 service or a phone call that needs to reach out. Now, if you think of that, the reason that is so set up such way, end-to-end that stack is dependent, this application to hardware to a service, and even to integration. But the whole idea of OpenStack is to disaggregate that, right? To create that abstraction layer, to provide that flexibility at the infrastructure layer where the applications can be very independent of that layer. So by going back and trying to fill those gaps and become compliant to an ETSI standards, I think we are going against our fundamental foundations. Now, I know you guys are going into a purchaser or people have the buying power, so we're trying to meet their needs. But what if we push that back? I think the approach should be different. It shouldn't be just, okay, there's a standard and you follow it, and we should be compliant. What's your thought on that? And I think it's a time now that open community should have its own standard body, and they should be in that table and try to negotiate with these vendor-driven or service provider-driven standard bodies to have a say in those standards.
Well, I fully agree with you, and especially like in the last minute when you turned around and said initially you said maybe standards are not, or I heard standards are no longer relevant, and at the end you said maybe we need to do standards differently or drive them differently, and that's exactly what happens. I mean, of course, also in open source we love standards, right? Because it saves development work, right? It gives us a concrete target. It just needs to be a standard that's been created based on existing implementations, and then you distill the standards from those, right? We have those in the, let's say in the container space, right? Docker was there first as a good implementation. Now they're creating a standard for the container runtime, for the container image format, etc., right? We have standards all over the place in open source. We're just creating them differently, implementation first, and then standards follow as a kind of encoding the best practices that we have in the industry. And then, of course, if you look into standards bodies like W3C or also IETF, they require implementations to be there first, and then they add things like internationalization or maybe accessibility, so things that are important in society, if you want, right? But that are not always provided by the market as such. So I agree with you that standards as we did them in the past may be something of lower relevance, right? Let's say it carefully. But we still need standards. We just need to provide a new model. And this is kind of this transition period that we are in. We need to find a way how to bridge these, how to reconcile these two communities, if you want.
Okay, any other questions? Oh.
It's not a question, it's just an information to you. The OpenStack Blazor project is in charge of resource reservation that you mentioned in the gap. So I will go to tomorrow's sessions to discuss that.
Yes, please come.
Yeah.
Yes, I know about Blazor, and yes, I'm happy that
Yeah.
you are doing the resource reservation, but there are still some gaps.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
I think so.
Actually, we're also aware that you're collaborating with the Promise community in OpenNFV, and that are actually there to work together to really say, okay, these are the gaps, and how can we address them together?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah,
Thank
just the
you. Thank you.
information.
Yes. All right, any other comment or question? If not, then thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.